Hey, this is Tony Jones, and I'm coming at you for the hardest question. This week, it's the baptism of Jesus. So we're in this funny part of the liturgical year where we start. That's a fire in the background, by the way. That's how I roll. You know, we go right from Christmas into the Sunday when youth pastors get to preach on the Massacre of the Innocents, which I imagine most youth pastors forego the lectionary text and don't preach about it, although I think it's a pretty fascinating text and obviously has lots of hard theological questions involved. And then we go from that to the baptism of Jesus, which you could also preach about Epiphany, I guess, or something like that. But the baptism of Jesus raises all sorts of tricky questions, which this week on the blog, Russell tries to address with basically a parable from his grandfather's life, which I think is a great way to address this question of why in the world does Jesus need to be baptized. Even John doesn't really think Jesus needs to be baptized. He really thinks that he needs to be baptized by Jesus. In Matthew's gospel, it says John would have prevented him, saying, or John tried to prevent him, I guess would be another way to translate that. I need to be baptized by you, but you come to me. And instead, Jesus says, let it be so now, for it's proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. Well, one of the ways, of course, to understand this is to, tie it into Old Testament prophecies, to say that this is part of Jesus' journey of public ministry. It's part of what sets him apart as the Messiah. It's an anointing. He's reconfiguring the Essene ritual of purification, bathing, and things like this. Obviously, it has another kind of meaning to Baptists, like Russell. Grew up as a American Baptist, and so it has a different kind of meaning even for those kind of Christians. But I do think it's a huge theological question that hangs over this text and that would be fascinating to preach about this week. And that is, what is it for Jesus to introduce this term righteousness right at the beginning of his public ministry, as he demands that his cousin baptize him, when it would seem like how we usually see it is the Holy One, the clergy person who fulfills the role of the pastor or priest, is the one who does the baptizing of the unshriven person, whether it be the infant or the adult. So I guess the biggest question, the hardest question, I think, for a preacher in this week's gospel text on the baptism of Jesus is, as Russell asks, why does Jesus need to be baptized? And even more so, theologically, the question for me is, what in the world does he his baptism is to fulfill all righteousness? As preachers disabuse the congregation from our common perceptions of this term righteousness, because we bring so much to that word when we find it in a text like this. But for Matthew, the writer of the gospel, or even for Jesus, listeners by the banks of the Jordan River that day, what did they hear when Jesus used this term righteousness? All right, this is Tony Jones for thehardestquestion.org. Thanks and good preaching.